Hi guys, how are you doing? Welcome to today's episode of Bible in a Year. And today we're looking at very powerful chapters also, like the way we looked at it yesterday. But however, let's just get right into it. So in Genesis chapter 21, we'll be looking at 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25. So in Genesis chapter 21, we see the promised son who is now birthed, Isaac, from Sarah. And then in the later part of that chapter, we see how Sarah got displeased about Haggai and then spoke to Abraham about it. Abraham initially wanted to maintain diplomacy by not doing anything, but then God tells him, you know what, you have to do something because if you don't do something, there's going to be strife in this family because there's going to be a bitterness. If you think about it, if Sarah could do what she did when Haggai was pregnant, when she even did not have her own, talk more now when she has her own child. So there was a lot going on, and then God said to Abraham, you can do that. Just, let them depart from your surroundings and let them go to where they'll go to, but I will still make a nation out of them and all of that. So Abraham did the same thing and then saddled a horse and then took Haggai away. At the later part of that chapter, he and Abimelech had a confrontation again, and then they had a covenant together. And now here's the thing: Abimelech learned from his mistake or learned from what he did. What they say that thing once bitten, twice shy. So Abimelech said to Abraham, "Don't do falsely. Don't deal falsely with me. What you say is what you should do, and all of that." So Abraham and they became, cool friends, and they had a covenant together. The next chapter 22 speaks of the confirmation of Abraham's faith. This is the chapter that speaks to a man that has faith that has never been seen in the Bible before. Here's what I think that happened. So, when Abraham had his encounter with God and God says, sacrifice your son and all of that. So, Abraham decided to take Isaac. And when he was going, Isaac says, what are we going to be using to sacrifice? Because I can see the wood, I can see the knife, I can see all the things, but I'm not seeing the main ingredient, which is supposed to be a sacrificial lamb. And then Abraham says God will provide. What he did there was a prophetic declaration that he even didn't know. In the later part of that chapter, we see how God lifted Abraham's eyes and then he saw a ram and then he had to sacrifice that ram. However, my contemplation is with Isaac. So I'm thinking to myself, what was Isaac's contemplation when Isaac was being tied? What was his contemplation when he says God will provide, but then he still did not say anything when he mounted Isaac up on the stone to be slaughtered and to be sacrificed? What was Isaac's contemplation? Yet he stood there like a lamb. And then this reminds me of a test to which it feels like God was trying to check if Abraham could do something that he wants to do. Although what I would have reckoned was that Abraham would have done it in a way to say, I know God, I've seen the miracle of God, I've seen what God can do. Because God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in the previous chapter. So I see what God can do. So the point is, I would do this because I know He will bring another one for me, or He will probably raise this one up because I have seen the mighty works that He has done. So God probably tests to see, okay, can somebody give up their son just like the way I'm going to be doing? Okay, my father wants to sacrifice me. This is how he's going to end. He brought me to this life, so he's going to sacrifice me. Your will be done. That particular chapter was how I saw it. Now, later part of that chapter sees Nahor, the family of the brother of Abraham. Now, you see the reason why Nahor was put into the picture here. Chapter 23, we get to see that Sarah was buried. So Abraham had an interaction with Ephron and then asked for a land where he could bury Sarah. And then Ephron agreed. That was the whole of chapter 23. That was just a conversation and the encounter we had with Ephron. And then when Abraham was getting old, he then says to his servant, go to a certain place and pick up a wife for me. This is how the chapter is going. Go to a certain place and pick up a wife for me. And then the servant went. Remember, Abraham did not tell the servant how he should pick up the wife, but it was the servant who was in the line of action of what to do. because he knew that if he had seen many, he would not know exactly how to. So he said to God, God, direct my footsteps, order my footsteps so that I can pick the particular one that fits my master's description. So he says, God, this he gave a detailed description. This is the reason why, among others, going by this chapter alone, this is the reason why I feel like God does not pick a wife for you. However, you can align your will with his will. It is possible, because Abraham, like I said, Abraham did not tell the servant exactly how to pick the wife in this chapter. You can really, it just says, go and pick a wife for me from my father's house. He gave a caveat, only one caveat. And then the servant says to Abraham, okay, he will do this. But then if the servant says to God, I want to be able to fit the description of my master, so I will lay down certain rules that I wish or I beg of you to make possible by the covenant that you have with my master. That was how that went. So when the servant came to the well and then gave the rules, and then Rachel comes in and offers water, because the rule was that the rule that the servant gave was, whoever comes here gives me water to drink and then gives my servant my flock, that would be the woman that I would take to my master. And luckily, the woman that he calls to take to his master is Nahor's son's daughter. Nahor's son's daughter, and Nahor is the brother to Abraham, so he's still within the family. So that happens, and then we're able to see how Rebecca was picked. 25 sees Abraham and Keturah, how Abraham took for himself another wife. And now this is the reason why I said in the previous chapter that Abraham, even if he had twins with Hagar or had triplets with Hagar, the promised child is not from that womb. The womb where the promised child is supposed to come from is from Sarah. So there is no other seed that would take the precedence of that promised child, that would take that role of that promised child. Hence the reason why it had to be from Sarah. And then when Keturah came into the picture, gave birth, God didn't say so much about the sons of Keturah or the daughters of Keturah. Right. So when Abraham died, we see the entrance of Isaac, who was the promised child. Now, I asked the question earlier in the last chapter, that what promise do you think Abraham fulfilled? What promise do you think Abraham entered into? Because for all of the promises that God gave to Abraham did not see any of them. Now Isaac also almost did not see, not even almost, Isaac did not see any of the promises. Because in this chapter 25, we see how there's the introduction of the sons of Isaac, Esau and Jacob. We see the introduction of the sons of Isaac, Esau and Jacob. And then that's the end of Isaac in terms of the conversation of this chapter. And then we see how Esau tells his birthright. This is the same chapter 25. The later part of that chapter tells us how Esau sees his birthright being given to Jacob because of food. What that taught me particularly is to ensure that when you are striving, where you are going through struggles, be careful the things you utter. Be careful the things you supplement, or be careful the things you exchange for your destiny because of a temporary fix. It was the hunger that could not be satisfied, so he sold his destiny, sold his birthright for something that could be fixed. The first thing that comes to my mind when I see this chapter, when I read this chapter, is the idea of lust, is the idea of the hunger to satisfy the flesh in this particular aspect. But then that's not the main verse of our chapter. So we've run through the stories between 21 to 25. So my chapter that gave me a certain understanding was the chapter where Isaac was giving birth to. That's chapter 21. And then in that part where Abraham dismissed Hagar. Now, Hagar went to the wilderness and God appeared to Hagar, because Hagar was already in a state of dissolution. So Hagar was now saying, okay, I cannot watch my son die, and then pushed him to one side and faced the opposite side. Remember, God had already given a promise to Hagar through the angel to say, this is descendant. God had a proposition God had a understanding with Agai to say, this child, yes, it is not the promised child, but it comes from a covenant man. It is a seed that I will honor. So God tells Agai that, but then Agai still did not believe. So Agai puts the son one side and then stays the opposite side and wanting the son to die and all of that. What that taught me, and then in the thick of that action, Agai heard from God, lift up her eyes rather, and her eyes was open to see a well, and they could drink water and then get satisfied. What that tells me is that whenever we're going through trouble, our natural instincts is to lay down. Our natural instincts is to look down. Our natural biological or whatever instincts it is as man is to feel down. However, that thing about suffering is when you're going through trials and tribulations, the first part of it is to look up. The second part that I learned from this particular chapter, besides looking up, when you're going through issues, you're only focused on the issues. When you're going through trials and tribulation, you're only focused on the trial and tribulation. You're never open to seeing the possibilities. So it is possible that aside from self-inflicted afflictions and trials, it is possible that when you're going through seasons, remember we talked about seasons in the last chapter, if you're going through seasons, it is important to seek God's intervention. But besides seeking God's intervention, ask God to open your eyes to see the possibilities that exist in that trial, because it was until God opened her eyes that she could see the well. Possibility that was that she would have passed by that well without seeing it, because her eyes was not open, or because she was focused on the problem at hand. How will I feed my child? How will I do this? Yes, trials and tribulations occur, but when we go through these things, we ought to open our eyes to see. Ask God to open your eyes to see the possibilities of the glory of God in those trials and in those tribulations. That was my take from that particular chapter, and I hope this has been helpful to you.